So I should have, but did not prepare a handout for today. So I will. I put on my note to do it tomorrow, and I know. So don't take time to write down tables. I will have a handout tomorrow that I'll bring on Thursday. That'll have the tables on them. Most of the tables. I included at the end, I don't know if I'll get to it, I included at the end the work that I've been doing most recently on services and the rise of recovery, excuse me, the slowing of recovery, rise of services and the slowing of recovery, there we go. Those tables are in from a paper that's on my website, but I will put all this together in a handout and put it online tomorrow or so. Lots of people have been coming and talking to me and to the GSIs about your term paper topics. I sat this morning in a day-long conference that Professor Eichengreen is organizing. It's happening over in the faculty club, and said to Hugh Rockoff, oh, I ought to bring you over a show and tell to my class, because you're one of the authors of our textbook, but he's over there in the faculty club. So anyway, Professor Eichengreen organized a conference today that's brought in people from Europe and throughout the United States. This, the future of the euro, lessons from history. And as I sat there, I thought, this is exactly what the term paper is, right? So there's a contemporary question, which is the future of the euro, and then there are 4 panels of 3 professors each who are talking about work that they have done in economic history, and the question is whether or not the work that they've done in economic history, be that economic history of the United States or economic history of Europe, is relevant for addressing the question of the future of the euro. That's precisely the kind of thing that we want you to do in your paper. We're not asking you in your paper to resolve, for instance, whether or not the euro will survive. We're asking you in your paper to address the question of whether or not some historical episode that's been analyzed by economic historians, so for instance, one thing today was about the development of national banking during the Civil War, and whether that moved from having a system of I don't know how many states there were at the time, 30-ish separate state banking systems into having a unified banking system in the United States. Is that a relevant historical episode for understanding the question of the future of the euro today? So sometimes, as I've said to many people in my office hours, we don't care whether your answer is yes or no. Once you have your contemporary issue and your historical episode, we don't care whether your answer is yes, this is a good historical episode for understanding the contemporary issues because these are the parallels, or your answer may be no, this is not a good historical analogy for this contemporary issue because of these differences. And it doesn't really matter whether your answer is yes or no. What really matters is your defense of your answer. So either you're going to show out the parallels between the historical issue and the contemporary issue. In that case, your answer is yes, this is a good historical analogy, or you're going to point out the differences between the historical eepisode and the contemporary issue, in which case your answer is nope, this is not a good historical analogy, even though somebody at first blush might think so. Fascinating conference still going on, really cool people. I wanted to say, oh, go over there and you can see all these people. Most of them are cool. Some are boring. Absolutely, yeah. So yeah, your answer could be yes, in these ways it's a good historical analogy, but in these other ways it's a bad historical analogy. Absolutely. And as somebody pointed out in office hours yesterday, the essay question that's found on both midterms is essentially what we want you to do for the term paper. That's in fact why I repeated the same exact essay question on the second midterm to underscore that point. So, any other questions having to do with term paper? Yeah. The contemporary episode? The contemporary episode can be domestic or can be U.S. or foreign. The history that you're referring to needs to be U.S. economic history, since after all that's what this class is. Yeah. So take 115 next year and you can write a paper that looks at European economic history. We're supposed to offer next spring. So next fall or spring. We've got a visitor coming. We'll teach it next year. So, any other questions? 115. Okay, cool. All right. I want to finish up talking about subprimes and housing and the Mian and Sufi article, and then start talking about the rise of services. I do not expect to get all the way through these slides today, partly because I love talking about both of these subjects so much that it's really hard for me to shut up and be concise and move on. And so I will probably many times today mutter something to myself and then stop a sentence and go on to another sentence, and that's me trying to self-censor and stay focused so that I can actually get through other topics before the end of the semester. There were some questions that came up at the end of the class on Thursday and in office hours as well, and so I want to show you a few other things about the housing boom that led into the financial crisis, and then make sure that we're all on board about that, and then I've addressed the questions that you may have before we start looking at the Mian and Sufi article itself. So that's the plan. All right, here we go. So in general, I skipped over this graph on Thursday. In general, the housing prices soar with easy credit. And so if we draw a picture that has housing prices, price of the house up here on the vertical axis and quantity of houses down here on the horizontal axis, and we've got some initial downward sloping demand curve D1 and some initial upward sloping supply curve S1, finds your equilibrium, gives us price P1 and quantity Q1. And in the story of what happened in the first decade of the century, the first piece of the story is very easy credit. That it became very easy for people to get loans to buy houses. We talked about the various kinds of crazy no-doc loans that we had during the heyday. And credit is a complementary good to buying a house. So if you're going to buy a house, a complement, something that you buy that goes together with, a complement to buying a house is getting a loan. So you make it easier and cheaper to get a loan. That's decreasing the price of the complementary good. That increases the demand for the primary good, which in this case is the house. Takes and shifts the entire demand curve to the right. Shift your demand curve to the right, you get demand curve T2. So that the ease of getting credit to buy houses leads to a big increase in demand, which really pushes up the price of houses. And I told many of you the story, maybe even in this class, I can never remember what story I tell when, about what happened on our street in 2005 when the house across the street and the house up the street from us went on the market. The house across the street, they both sold for 25% over list. They both had been listed at prices that we thought were outrageously high to begin with. The folks across the street had 14 offers to choose from, and in fact did not choose the highest priced offer. They chose an offer from a couple that they thought did bid very, very high, had a little baby, and they liked the idea that this couple was moving to the East Bay from San Francisco and wanted to buy their first house to raise a family in, and this is a great family neighborhood, and they really wanted it to be a family with kids. So these are two houses on our street over in El Cerrito that sold 25% over list, which means that these houses, which are standard 1950s, they now call them mid-century, which makes it sound like somehow good. 1950s, which means no insulation, bad windows, and not enough outlets. Both of these houses sold for about $900,000. I went on Zillow the other day just to see what Zillow currently thinks the prices of our houses are in our neighborhood, and they're still around 600 or so is what they're selling for today. So these houses had listed at outrageously high amounts. They sold for 25% above the list price, and this was easy credit. So it was the ease of getting credit. Now, in some areas of the country, the response to this this response to the increase in prices, which of course means there's a lot of profit to be made, the response in some parts of the country was for builders to build more houses. And so part two of our story is that in response to the rising prices and the profit opportunities there, there's more building that takes place. And so that gives us an increase in the supply curve. So shift your supply curve to the right, give yourself supply curve S2. And that's going to temper the increase in prices. So the easy credit made prices rise from P1 to P2. The construction means that prices wind up at P3 in between those two. In some parts of the country, that increase in building meant that prices still were rising, but just not as at rapid a rate. In other places in the country, that increase in building shifts the supply curve far enough to the right that you get actually the beginnings of this decline in housing prices. The overall picture of what happened to housing prices is captured with this graph, which I forgot to put the source down here. This is from the Calculated Risk blog, which has great graphs for things like this. And this is the Case-Shiller Composite Price Index, 10 cities versus 20 cities, and you can see here, whether you're looking at this, the more narrow or the broader price index, the incredible soaring of housing prices that takes place, particularly in this region here, which is, so here's 2003, draw it like that, and then the peak here happens in 2006. So housing prices peak in 2006. Remember for our story the other day about people who got these 228s and 327s and they needed to refinance, the issue was not when did housing prices peak, but when did we hit an inflection point on that curve? That is, when did housing prices start going up only 15% per year instead of 20% per year? Because people who were buying these mortgages that were the 228s and the 327s, who were dependent upon the ability to refinance those mortgages in order to be able to keep their houses and afford their monthly payments, they needed housing prices to go up. If you were in a 228, you needed a 25% increase in the housing price to be able to refinance into a standard loan. If you were in a 327, you needed about a 15 to 20% increase in housing prices in order to be able to refinance into a standard loan. So it was a slowing of the pace of the increase that leads to the initial downturn. Leads to the initial, people are not able to refinance, people start to default, and then once people start to default, that gets us to step 3 of our picture, which I should draw in some really scary color. I don't know what a scary color is. Orange? That's not scary. Okay, this is a scary color. Whatever your scary color is, we get to the defaults. That's supposed to be an exclamation point. There. We get to defaults, people who are not able to make their mortgage payments and who begin to default. And when the defaults happen, even before the foreclosures happen, when the defaults happen, that begins to restrain the amount of credit that's available to people to buy houses. And so then you get the demand curve starts to shift back. And as the demand curve shifts back, those housing prices fall further. In some places, as we know, as I showed you in the graph there and told you from the story, housing prices fall below where they had been many years before. So we get the peak in 2006. Housing prices continued to fall from 2006. They finally hit bottom. What is this? This is about early 2009 is when housing prices finally hit bottom. And then you can see there that on a national level, housing prices have just sort of maintained. Now, there are certain little bubbles right now. So the East Bay and the South Bay currently are in a bubble. So we've got another, hopefully it's a baby bubble. I hope it's not a big bubble. I hope it's a baby bubble. But once again, we're back in this area of the country. We're back to where people are getting multiple offers and houses are selling for over list price. That's not true throughout the country. Certainly in Las Vegas and parts of Arizona, they're still experiencing very low house prices. Sam had a question. So what they're looking at is they're looking at house prices of houses. They are, do you know about it in detail?
What's the price of this house?
Turn around so they can hear you.
What's the price of the house sold today or what's sold in the past? We want to track profit over time and see how much they sell for that house sold. So it's case children will track like resale prices of housing in the so the guy in the so easy is your the company that's converting is so the 10 on the 10 days or 20 days.
Oh, because it's the only housing price index that we have. Yeah. Oh, okay, that was the question. Yeah, why we look at the Case-Shiller index, because that is what we have. Because the Case-Shiller housing price index is the housing price index. There isn't you can't go on the BLS website and get some independent government BLS housing price thing. Yeah. Okay, all right. This piece I did. So this is a piece that I ended with on Thursday where I talked about the 228s and 327s and the effort to refinance. And if your housing price rose fast enough, you were able to refinance. If it didn't rise fast enough, then you were not able to refinance, which led to a lot beginnings of the default. So people whose mortgage payments went from say $1,300 to $2,900 a month, who couldn't possibly pay $2,900 a month, stop paying. That is, they go into default on their mortgage. Takes, in some cases, depending on the bank, takes some time for those foreclosures to begin to happen. We had a huge rash of foreclosures that began, particularly 2007, 2008, 2009. We've had a variety of programs to try to stem some of the foreclosures. The bottom line of all this is a whole bunch of financial institutions failed. Now, the failure of the financial institutions gets back. Oops, I didn't animate my things today, did I? Gets back to these mortgage-backed securities. So I mentioned these real fast on Thursday and had some questions, so I thought I'd better add a slide, which I added like half an hour ago, so it's not what you printed out. You like my reality? Yes. So what's a mortgage-backed security? So with a mortgage-backed security, the bundler, which could be somebody like Morgan Stanley or Bear Stearns or who was it, Merrill Lynch or any of these other places, name these people. Who was Bear Stearns the one that croaked? Lehman, I couldn't remember Lehman. So the bundlers, they would take, well, let me back this up. So you're going to buy a house. You go in, no longer do you really, some people go into a bank, but most people would go into a mortgage broker, which is a person who makes their living by finding a place that will lend you money to buy a house. And so you go into a mortgage broker, you fill out all the paperwork with a mortgage broker, and that's the person who had that wonderful exchange, right? Yeah, with Amol on Thursday about trying to get him into that mortgage, which he didn't want. So the mortgage broker is not going to be very happy with you. So the mortgage broker works to get you into a loan with who knows what bank. So call it fly-by-night bank. When we bought our house in 2003, and we refinanced a couple times because the mortgage rates kept going down. And literally, the mortgage that we had was initially with like Texas Star Bank or Fly-by-Night Bank of Texas. I don't know, something like this. And so the mortgage gets written initially with Fly-by-Night Bank of Texas. The Fly-by-Night Bank of Texas, within minutes, practically, literally within days, sells the mortgage to somebody else. Sometimes to somebody like Chase, who then gives the mortgage to one of these bundlers, who takes and bundles the mortgage together with about 1,000 or other mortgages, give or take, and makes this big bundle of about 1,000 mortgages. And then they chop that bundle into like 1,000 different pieces. And then they sell those pieces. And those pieces are called mortgage-backed securities. So you can buy a 1/1000th share in this bundle of 1,000 mortgages, and your share is called a mortgage-backed security because it's a security, it's a piece of paper that represents a promise of somebody else, in this case the bundler or whomever else they pass this off to pay you money over time in exchange for the funds that you gave to buy your 1/1000th of this bundle of 1,000 mortgages. Those pieces, those mortgage-backed securities, were sold to anybody who wanted them. They were sold to retirement funds. They were sold to individuals. They were sold to governments. They were sold to banks. They were sold anywhere. I was in a meeting with high people in these various companies that were doing this. When was this? Circa 2004, 2005. And I asked them, who's buying these things? Because it was clearly, 2005, it was clear this was a house of cards that was all going to come down. I said, who's buying these mortgage-backed securities? And he said, we don't know. He said, we don't know who's buying them. They're being sold on the street, so they're being sold through what the equivalent of E-Trade, but on a higher level of E-Trade. They're being sold on the street. We think the Chinese are buying them. And we don't really care, because if the Chinese are buying them, then it means that when this whole thing collapses, they're the ones who are going to lose, and that's fine with us. So this is one of the top executives in one of these companies that's creating these mortgage-backed securities. So the people who are creating these mortgage-backed securities, they don't know who's buying these things. They just know that there's somebody out there, someplace in the world who's buying these mortgage-backed securities. And they don't really care who's buying them, because once they sell the mortgage-backed security, it's no longer their problem if those mortgage-backed securities become worth less. Now, the idea and the reason that people are willing to buy mortgage-backed securities, the reason is that, look, you're buying 1/1000th of 1,000 different mortgages. So at some point, you took some class in college, and it was about risk and return, and they talked about diversification of risk, and they talked about if you have a whole bunch of, I don't know, it was a warm day, I wasn't really focused, I was looking at my Facebook, but the process, something about diversification of risk, and if there's ever diversification of risk, it can surely come from having 1,000 different assets and having just 1/1000th of 1,000 different assets. That's got to be diversified. So you had a lot of people who thought they were buying a very safe asset, because they thought 1,000 different mortgages, what could possibly happen that would make 1,000 people all default at the same time? Yeah, go back and study the part about diversification of risk. The part about diversification of risk that's important is there has to be orthogonality. Independence, thank you. There has to be independence of the things that create risk in each of those individual assets for the package, the bundle of assets to be less risky than the individual assets. Now, part of what happened was the ratings agencies, so Moody's is one of these rating agencies, the ratings agencies who were in the back pocket of the mortgage-backed security companies, the ratings agencies put their stamp of approval on these things and said these are very low risk. So Moody's gives them a AAA rating, says, yep, these are really good, safe assets, nothing to worry about, there's diversification of risk here. And so lots and lots of people were willing to buy these mortgage-backed securities, and these mortgage-backed securities are paying a decent rate of return. In each of these bundles, there's going to be some subprime mortgages that jacks up the return on these things. There's going to be some prime mortgages that had a lower rate of return, but overall, they were paying a pretty decent rate of return, particularly because people thought they were almost risk-free. Where do Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac come in? Fannie and Freddie come in the guaranteeing of the mortgages of the individuals. So some people who have these mortgages, their mortgages are guaranteed by Fannie and Freddie before the mortgage goes into the bundle, gets chopped and sold. Now, the thing is that if the likelihood of default is dependent not upon simply whether some individual loses their job or some individual gets sick, right? So if the likelihood of somebody defaulting on their mortgage is simply a factor of whether or not they get sick, then in fact there would be a lot of independence of the risk of each of these 1,000 mortgages in your bundle, and having 1,000 mortgages in your bundle would give you a very low overall risk if it has to do with getting sick. If it was getting fired, right? If the risk came from somebody getting fired from their job for malfeasance, that's going to be a pretty independent risk. It's not going to be something that's correlated from person to person, and having 1,000 different mortgages is going to give you a pretty low risk. If, however, the likelihood of default comes from, let's say, unemployment, and if your mortgages come from one particular geographic area, and a lot of people in that geographic area wind up unemployed, now you've got risks that are not independent. Now you've got a whole bunch of mortgages in your bundle that are going into default at the same time. That's increasing your risk. And finally, if the likelihood of default is coming from what's happening to the price of houses, and that if housing prices stop going up at 25% per year and start going up at only, say, 15 or 12 or 10% per year, that slowing of the rate of growth of housing prices increases the risk of default. Now we've got an event that they call systemic risk, that there is something in the system that creates a shared risk by everybody in the pool. And when there's systemic risk, when there is some risk that is built into the system that everybody shares, then pooling 1,000 different mortgages together, that does not lower the aggregate risk. It means actually you're screwed. So that when the housing prices start to go up at a slower rate and people go into default, and then because people are going into default, the increase in the housing prices gets lower, and then because more and more people are going into default and the foreclosures, and then they start putting those foreclosures back on the market, which by the way shifts that supply curve to the right again. When the housing prices actually start to decline, and they're declining not just in isolated areas, it's not just the Las Vegas market, but it's across the country in almost all of the markets, then voila, you've got a mess. You've got a whole lot of people who are holding on to these assets, these mortgage-backed securities, that suddenly are going bad. Because yes, it's 1/1000th of 1,000 mortgages, but 560 of your mortgages just went into default. You've got a worthless asset. What's the role of credit default swaps? Okay, so the role of credit default swaps, CDS, whoops, why did that go forward? I don't know. There. CDS or credit default swaps. Okay, a credit default swap is a fancy name for an insurance policy. So there's a logic to credit default swaps. So the logic to credit default swaps is if I'm a lender, I want to somehow insure myself against the possibility that the person I've lent to is not going to pay me back. And so I can go and I can buy an insurance policy. So I'm going to, Mole didn't want my money. I'm going to lend Sam some money. You'll take my money. I'm a lender. I'm going to lend Sam some money. We're going to have a contract. She's going to sign the contract. I've got some provisions in the contract to really smack her if she doesn't pay me back. So some of these default provisions. But nevertheless, I'm going to go out and I'm going to find an insurance company. It's going to be the Johnson Insurance Company over here. And I'm going to buy an insurance policy from the Johnson Insurance Policy that's going to, and I'm going to pay just a little bit for that insurance. And his insurance is going to pay me if you default. So now he's the one that's actually bearing the risk that you might default. And that insurance contract is called a credit default swap. That in and of itself makes perfect sense. And having credit default swaps is what allows lenders to see past the asymmetric information problem. I don't know what's really going on, particularly since I did you a no-doc loan. I don't know what's really going on in your financial life and whether or not you're really going to pay me back. And so if I can give that risk off to Johnson Insurance Company, I'm much more willing as a lender to lend because now I don't have to worry so much about the adverse selection problem or even the moral hazard problem because he's going to cover my risk. Now the piece that happened with the credit default swaps is that the Johnson Insurance Company over here realized that he had a good thing because he missed the lecture on systemic risk. And he was on Facebook during the lecture about diversification of risk, right? And so he thinks, well, gosh, I can write these insurance policies against the likelihood that Sam's going to default, and I only have to pay out if Sam does default. And I could write one of these insurance policies and not just give it to the lender, I can give it to anybody who walks in the door. And so the credit default swaps became something that people who were not party to the transaction were able to purchase. So everybody else in the class goes to the Johnson Insurance Company, gives him a little bit of money, buys a credit default swap, and if you default, he has to pay off everybody in the room, even though nobody else in the room has any business in our business, right? Yeah. What was the real name of the Johnson Insurance Company? AIG. That there's no regulation.